We are going to talk about Sampson and Delilah this morning, and the story of Sampson and Delilah. How many people here remembered the story of Sampson and Delilah? Okay, so quite a few of you. And you can find that in the book of Judges, especially chapters 13 through 16. And I want to highlight just a passage out of the 16th chapter, so if we can call that up. And I'm going to read verses 18 through 22 out of the 16th chapter of Judges. And it says this: When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more, he has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for somebody to come shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, "Sampson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they sent him to grinding grain in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. So this morning, after reading that, I thought we are going to talk about everybody's favorite topic this morning, sin. Right? Yeah, some of you laugh. Some of you are like, I don't want to listen to sin. I mean, it's not a fun topic to talk about sin, right? And you're like, wait a minute. I thought Samson was about cutting his hair off, and then he didn't have his strength, and he tore down a building and all of this. But as I was rereading the story again, after many years of actually paying attention to the story, it has everything to do with sin. It has everything to do with making decisions that do not line up with our lifestyle or with God. So that is what we are going to talk about. But a quick recap here. Sampson, and we can start reading this in the 13th chapter of Samuel. Sampson was one of only, I think, 4 people in the Bible whose birth was announced. Okay, that they came out and said, "You will have a child, and you will name him Sampson," which actually means sunshine, and he will be set apart. So Samson was a Nazirite, okay? Samson was this religious person that was setting his life for God, and they took vows, and they took their commitment to God seriously. They could not drink. They could not cut their hair. They could not touch anything that was dead or dead animals. They had to keep themselves pure, and then God would use them for a special purpose. So they believed they were set aside. But the thing with Samson is you have these commitments, and other than not cutting his hair, Samson really did not fulfill anything that he signed up to do. Samson did not fulfill anything that the Nazirites were supposed to do. His life really did not match up with that calling. So it started to I started to think about that idea of sin. And even though it's not a fun topic, we have to take it seriously. And in our Bible study on Wednesday night, the book that we've been studying, we were talking about how you have 2 camps when you talk about sin. You have some people that think sin is about all these little things that we do and the way we mess up and the way we fall short. And then you have another group of people that would say sin has more to do with these relationships and what damages we cause. And I was thinking about Dietrich Bonhoeffer too, because when he talks about Adam and Eve and the original sin, and when sin entered into the human race, if you will, he says that sin at the base is us trying to be like God, wanting to know what God knows, wanting to be above our station in a sense, so that we strive and we try to take matters into our own hand, or we don't take God seriously because we think that we know more than God. It breaks a relationship that we have, not only with God, but with each other as well. So why is this important? Because again, as much as we don't want to talk about it, sin matters. And I can guess that some of you, when I say the word sin, you come up with a list in your head. I remember when I was growing up in the church that we grew up with, it was always kind of put in our head about sin and how you don't want to do it because it's bad. So we were told, you don't want to swear because if you swear, it's a sin. You don't want to drink because drinking is a sin. You can't have sex before marriage because that is a sin. You can't lust after people because that is a sin. You can't gossip because that is a sin. You can't do this because that is a sin. And all of these things carry consequences. So if I step out of line, I always believed that I was going to be struck by God somehow, right? That God was going to flick me in the head or hurt me, or I was going to have to suffer in some way, or worse, if I died and I did not ask for forgiveness and I had all of these sins in my life, oh man, I was probably going to burn in hell, right? We think that sin is all of these little things. And maybe there's some truth to that, but I think sin is bigger than that. I think the issue here is that we miss the point, and that sin is bigger to God than just these little things that we make it. Okay? It's not about balancing the scales. Sin matters to God because it damages our relationship to God and to each other. That is why sin matters. Okay, it's not about all these little things that we think it is. Yes, we shouldn't do certain things. And yes, we have standards to live up to. And yes, all of those things have consequences, but they have more consequences, not necessarily to myself, but to the relationships around me. Sin has a ripple effect, right? And it destroys people. And it destroys the person, and it destroys everybody else that we kind of come into contact with. It's toxic. That is why a big part of God talks about being blameless and trying to live your life not in a sinful way, because you want to build up relationships and you want to build up your relationship with each other and with God. Because sin does one thing very well. It alienates us from each other, whether we want to admit that or not. The stories, Adam and Eve, Sampson, all of these other ones, they play out in our lives every day because we fall into these same temptations, we fall into these same systems, if you will, and we repeat patterns. Even though Sampson and others are in the cloud of witnesses, as the choir sang about, and as you can read in the book of Hebrews, they still had faults. And they still had to deal with the idea that sometimes they broke relationships with God. So back to Sampson. There's two things I want to highlight about Sampson's life that I think we can miss when we just read the story and we think it's about cutting hair and we think it's about all of these things. Sampson had a weakness. And Sampson's biggest weakness, well, there was two things. One, he did not live by the standards that God set for him, right? He didn't obey. Even when he ripped the lion apart and found the honey in his mouth, Sampson was not supposed to be touching a dead animal, but he still did, and he hid that from his father and his family because he didn't want anybody to know that he actually touched a dead animal. But even more so than that, Sampson dealt with sexual sin. Sampson loved women, and he loved women that he shouldn't have loved, and he messed around, and that was his biggest weakness. He kept falling. But one of the things that struck me was, here's Sampson, right? And Sampson is supposed to be this man of God. And Sampson is supposed to be set apart. And one of the questions that he is asked by people, they ask him, they say, Sampson, where does your strength come from? Now, that question at first you might be thinking, well, it comes from God. We know this. We've read the story. But think about the question that is asked here by people that know Sampson. Sampson, where does your power come from? Now, it should have been very evident where Samson's power came from. They should have been, you know what? Samson gets his power from God. Samson is a godly man. Samson is this holy Nazarite. Samson, we know, has this relationship with God, and that's where his power comes from. But they don't see that. They don't see that because nothing in Samson's life points to God. Nothing in Samson's life points to him having a relationship with God at all. So people are confused. And they say, Samson, where did your power come from? Think about that. When people look at us, do they know where we get our power from? When people look at our lives, do they say, you know what? John is a man of God, and John tries. Or do they say, John, what are you doing? John, is God even part of your life? Is my life modeled in such a way that it draws people to God, or will people be confused about what I'm about? Because Samson should have had no problem pointing people to God, but his life did not match up with what he was doing. So when people look at us, do they know where our power comes from? Now, we can all answer that really quick. Yes, God. But answer truthfully. Think about your lives and how you live. Do our actions lead up to what we are proclaiming? So this story isn't just about Samson. It's about us and what happens when we choose against God. What happens when we are alienated from the ones we love and from God. And then one commentator said verse 20 of chapter 16 is one of the saddest verses in the Bible. And when I read that, I'm like, wait, what is she talking about here as she's writing this commentary? And verse 20 says, Samson did not know that the Lord had left him. Samson did not know that the Lord had left him. In other words, Samson tried to reach for God, or Samson tried to say, okay, I got to get my act together, and he thought he was going to have his strength again, and he thought he was going to do these acts that God has blessed him with, and he went to try, and then he did not realize that God had left him. And they said that is one of the saddest verses in the Bible. And the commentator said, think about that, because he thought he was with God, but again, nothing in his life pointed him towards God. So his life was no different with God or without God in such a way that he had no idea God wasn't even with him. Now, in our own lives, do we live in a way that we are connected to God, in a way that if God left us, we would know, or would we not notice at all? Do we live a life that is connected to God, that if God left, we would know? Or do we not feel any difference and we have no idea if God is with us or not? That's why she said this is a sad verse, because he wasn't even sure God was there. And his life didn't make any difference. So he didn't even know God had left him. Sin matters because it disconnects us from God. And now some people will say, well, I'm not sure how to interpret that verse because I've always been told, or my theology says, that God never leaves us, that we're the ones that leave God. And that may be true. But there's a sense that when God says, if I am not welcome here, I am going to take a step back and let you do what you want to do. And you will be outside of this presence of God. God never leaves. God is always there. And we'll see God return in this story. But at the moment when we choose against God, what is God supposed to do? So God steps back and leaves us to our own devices. And then what has happened? Samson finds himself with no hair, and now he's a slave, and he's grinding grain in this labor camp, if you will. Because he didn't realize that God had left him. But sin, it's not just about keeping scores. When I was Catholic, we always had this image of scales. And when we get to heaven, the good better outweigh the bad. And if it's the other way around, oh man, we're in trouble. Right? It's not about keeping scores. And I know some of you may disagree with me, but God is not keeping score. God is not up there keeping a list of all of our wrongdoings, and when we get to heaven, God's not going to say, well, John, you know what? You sinned 7,582 times, and you were good 5 times, okay? Right? Which is probably accurate. But that's not what God's going to say. God's going to look at me, right? And God's going to go say, yeah, your life really didn't, balance out all that well. But really what I'm worried about here, John, is how was your relationship with the people you were around? Did you lift people up? Did you help people? Did you feed people? Did you clothe people? Did you draw people into me? Or did you push them further away? That is why sin matters. Because does my life live up to what God is wanting to do and the will of God? Or do I not point anybody towards God at all? So God says it's about this relationship. Were you connected to me, and were you connected to me in such a way that you were connected to other people. That is why it matters. But the story also shows us that there's consequences to sin. As much as I want to say sin is about relationships and it's not about this balancing act, I still have to pay for the damage I do. I still have to have consequences for the way that I mess up. And if you follow this story of Samson, at the end of that passage I read, it said, but then Samson's strength, his hair started to grow again, and his strength was returning to him, right? So somehow, Samson figured out, wait a minute, I'm not connected to God here. My life is not matching up to what I'm supposed to say. I'm chained here to some columns, and I'm about to die. And he yells out for God to say, God, give me some strength here to do your will, and I know I've messed up. So God breathed one last strength into Samson for this feat. And we all know the story where Samson pulls down the columns, right? But Samson died in that. So God breathed into Samson, allowed God's will to happen, and these Philistines died, but so did Samson. He could not get away from the consequences of his actions. We cannot get away from those consequences. If I decide to go out to a bar one night and I get really drunk, and then I make a bad decision and I get into a car and I kill somebody's innocent kid, right? God may forgive me. And God may say, John, you're okay and we'll work this out. But I will be doing that from a jail cell. It's not a get out of jail free card here, forgiveness. What it is, though, is grace and love. And God to say, I can fulfill you and will work through this, but you have a mess to clean up. You have things to deal with. You have to repair these relationships that you broke. And it takes time, and it takes energy, and it takes love, but you can do it. But first I have to realize that I need God in order to do that. God will bring us back and use us in spite of our weaknesses, right? The promise of the gospel is a promise of grace and reconciliation and restoration. That is the part of that. But may we not forget, and may we understand that other people look at us and other people say, how are these people of God supposed to be living so that I can do this? So when people look at us, do they see people of God or do they see something else? Just like Samson. When somebody asks us where our power comes from, can we just say God? Or better than that, do we live in such a way that nobody really even has to ask us that question because they know? Or do we fall short? We all battle. Samson had his weaknesses. We all have our weaknesses. We all have those times where we decide to choose against God, where we do things that we're not supposed to be doing. But ask yourself, what kind of damage is being done? Maybe if we quieted ourselves a moment before we made choices, and we'd understand that sin just doesn't affect me, maybe it would slow me down to know if I do this, it's going to affect other people. It's going to affect and have ripple effects. Sin does matter. But it matters because relationships are important. So we have to learn how to love God with everything we have, and then love each other with everything we have. That is our purpose. That is what we are supposed to be showing to the world. Maybe we have fallen short. Maybe we have messed up our priorities like Samson did, and we get blinded by the lust in our eyes for whatever that is, the temptations that come. But we know God will return if we return. So may we ask ourselves and wrestle with that question. What do people see when they look at us? Are we connected to God at this moment, or are we not? And I really think we should think about that verse. Verse 20. Samson did not know that God had left him. Would you know if the presence of God left you at this moment? Or would we have no clue because of the way we are living? That is something that we have to wrestle with. That has stuck with me this entire week, that one little verse, because it was powerful to me. There are times, I will be honest, there are times in my life where my faith wanes and it is dim like that lantern. And there might be days where if God left me, it would make no difference. But truly, when I am connected to God, I know whether God leaves or stays. I know that feeling. And I think all of you know that too. But what a powerful verse. Samson did not know that the power of God had left him. Wherever you find yourselves this morning, know that we are called to be set apart. Know that we are called to bring love and grace and peace to all of those around us. All of the relationships we have, even the ones that we don't want to have. Even the relationships that are tough and broken and hurtful. We are called to bring peace and try to connect people to God and to each other. Let us pray. Lord, let this story of Samson be a lesson. That even when we get blinded by the temptations and our lives do not match up to our callings, help us to realize, Lord, that connection that we lose to you is so powerful. Help us to stay connected. Because when we are connected to you, we are then connected to our sisters and brothers. When we are connected to you, we are connected to love and grace and peace. So whether we find ourselves connected and strong this morning, or whether we are disconnected and we've been lost for a while, come to us. Bring us back together and help us to be a witness to this world so that nobody will have to ask where our power comes from, because it will be evident in all that we do. Help us to be the people you have called us to be. And all of God's people said, Amen. If you'll please stand as we close the service.